Good afternoon, everyone. I'm A. Prince Albert III. I'm a global law scholar here at Georgetown. And in our Trade and Trust class, exploring the law and policy of globalization, I've chosen to write and present my work titled Digital Alchemy, The Decline of Privacy and Democracy. As you may suspect, the title is undoubtedly inspired by one of our texts, Mervyn King's The End of Alchemy, and I'll leave you in suspense about the cryptic meaning. Today I'll introduce the problematics that I'm trying to tackle and present to you my paper's central argument. Then we will do a very quick overview of trader services and data before tackling data brokering. Finally, I want to end by proposing some solutions and requesting your feedback about how to make my paper amazing and publishable. I really need help, guys. SLC Cambridge Analytica was a British data analytics firm that contracted with the Trump campaign in 2016. The company amassed enough data points on nearly every internet user in the United States of America without their consent. Cambridge Analytica built extensive personality profiles and deployed psychographic advertisement targeting, tailored for individual profiles. Every profile saw different advertisements, one tailored to their professed or implied political affiliations according to their likes and viewing history. Outlandish, unfounded conspiracy theories became the principal rationales for voting for or against either candidate. And effectively, 138 million Americans voted in 138 million different elections for 276 million different candidates. In an undercover video, Cambridge Analytica executives admitted to extorting politicians worldwide into using their services and spreading propaganda that preyed on fears of the targeted populace. A few years ago, nearly 30 Burmese military officials created fake Facebook profiles posting as fans of pop stars and national heroes. The military amassed large followings and began flooding Facebook with fake news, doctored photographs like the ones behind me, and memes inciting the Buddhist majority to turn on the nearly 1 million Rohingya Muslims there. Facebook acknowledged that it had been, quote, slow to act, end quote, in Myanmar after the UN found evidence of wide-scale human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, gang rapes, arson of Rohingya Muslim businesses and schools, villages, infanticides, and other high crimes. The United Nations and the International Criminal Court are pursuing prosecutions against named Burmese military officials and possibly Myanmar's president. Facebook-owned company WhatsApp has sued the now infamous Israeli surveillance firm NSO Group last Tuesday. In the complaint, WhatsApp accused the NSO Group of selling its Pegasus software to spy on government agencies to break into the phones of roughly 1,400 users across 4 continents. Targets included diplomats, political dissidents, journalists, and senior government officials. Targets hacked in Mexico, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain were identified in what WhatsApp called, quote, an unmistakable pattern of abuse, end quote, against dissidents who face, quote, assimilation attempts and threats of violence. For standing up against despotic, anti-democratic regimes in their respective native countries. The Saudi assassinated journalist Khashoggi's friend, Omar Abdulaziz, is one of the 7 journalists suing the spyware firm in Israel and Cyprus over being hacked through WhatsApp. What links these 3 scandals together is one of social networking services across borders, limiting democratic participation. And I believe that the international trade regime should do something to stop the use of social media and all internet services for evil. So what is my paper about? It's about the international trade of data, which obviously implicates consumer privacy. But who cares about your Facebook likes, your Amazon purchases, your Google search history, your deepest, darkest secrets overheard by your Alexa personal assistant? You have nothing to hide, right? While the vast majority of people have nothing to hide as individuals, the aforementioned scandals show that our individual consumer preferences are not what's at stake. Rather, our collective democratic aspirations to live in a civil society where we may not always get good governance right, but nonetheless we have the freedom to try. So does the existing international trade service regime adequately contemplate data? Of course not. This is a stoplight chart, one like we used to use in the military. It's actually quite intuitive. Red answers the question in the negative, yellow or amber represents a yes, no, or maybe, and green answers the question affirmatively. The GATS, the General Agreement in Trade in Services, is the treaty agreement entered into force in January 1995, directed by the World Trade Organization. The goal of the international trading system at large is to eliminate any trade barriers as many trade barriers as possible, and to permit the free flow of goods and services across borders. The principle of the most favored nation applies. The treaty outlaws two specific types of discrimination to catalyze cross-border trade. That's the whole point. However, members reserve the right to exert 7 exceptions and effectively discriminate against each other if they invoke the right reasons and provide some adequate context. The GATS panel is red because it does not mention trade and data at all, and in my humble opinion, the escape hatches render GATS vulnerable to overhaul by special interests. These exceptions will fracture the system when it comes to data privacy. Now, member states have sought clarification in cross-border exchanges and the provision of trade services, but the litigation panel is yellow because the panel and the appellate body shy away from judicial activism, attempting to hold states responsible for provisions to which they have not explicitly consented in a treaty process. Therefore, the cases clarify individual, very minute instances and provide some guidance, but they are not on point to our question about data abuse. In the bottom left panel, you will see some of the free trade agreements that the U.S. has agreed to over the last 15 years. These FTAs specifically mention data, but it's yellow because there's some cloudiness in these agreements. Notice that Chile and Jordan are not the most technologically advanced countries. The U.S. felt comfortable with signing FTAs, including data provisions with these countries with whom the U.S. does not really meaningfully exchange data. While some may argue that the agreement with Korea is promising, the trade between the two involves mostly technological hardware, invoking the GATT, not the GATS. The most interesting FTA is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are roughly 10 to 12 robust data provisions with major Asian exporters. But again, this multilateral agreement was risk-averse for the U.S. and only lasted a year. It's no longer in force. The only panel to be a light green, not even a bold green, is the commercial privacy regimes. We are talking about the GDPR in the European Union and the US-EU Privacy Shield. The US exchanges the most data with the European Union, so the agreement is strong to enable trade and services of data to continue, despite differences in the histories and legal frameworks of privacy, respectively. Also, APEX Privacy Framework is another example of multiple countries working through specific provisions of trade and data. Though not as robust as the former, its provisions show a substantial commitment to keeping data flowing. The U.S. Trade Representatives recognizes these systematic barriers to the international trade in services and data. First, investment restrictions in e-commerce website ownership, or limits on the ability for platforms to operate, impede market access. I believe market access disputes are best litigated at the WTO panel and appellate body levels. But data localization is a growing problem. It is the organized restriction of the flow of data beyond the country's borders, limited what websites and platforms are available, how they operate, what goods and services can be offered, like payments, shipping, tracking. These are not full bans, but national and local legislators creating rules whose effect is blocking data from exiting the jurisdiction. China and Russia are beginning to use data localization tactics to limit the export of the citizens' data while they continue to enrich themselves off their trade of goods and services. These countries are also engaging in anti-democratic political tactics inside their countries. For example, the Hong Kong protests and human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslims in eastern China Also, Russia's anti-gay propaganda law and crackdowns targeting LGBTQ+ people. Data localization generally is related to a concept called data balkanization or the splinter net, but more about that later. On to data brokering. Data brokers or information reselling companies amass enormous amounts of consumer data from online and offline sources and then organize and analyze that data into patterns of behavior. The data and analysis is sold to targeting companies and other business entities to target consumers based on analyzed trends. The practice is problematic because, in a primary instance, it invades consumers' reasonable expectations of privacy and subjects unwitting consumers to unforeseeable discrimination. In a secondary instance, again, your Facebook likes, your Amazon purchases, your Google search history, and your deepest, darkest secrets overheard by your personal assistant are not about you, they're about us. Our purchasing preferences and lifestyle behaviors, independent of our own narration and clarification, may be weaponized against our way of life by people who don't live here, people miles and oceans away gambling on our politics. Their analyses of our behaviors may not even be correct, but they can be used to profile us, fragment our realities, while running away with the bag. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission's 2014 report, Data Brokers, A Call for Transparency and Accountability, studied 9 data brokers as a cross-section of an industry with then over 1,000 companies. The FTC was disturbed by what they found and suggested more transparency and reporting requirements for the industry. They were alarmed, but too timid to stop the abuse. The FTC saw the harm in 2014 and did nothing. That's why Cambridge Analytica happened 2 years later. Ashley Kumpil, a jurist from Northwestern University, recommends that Congress should enact adequate legislation to increase the regulatory scrutiny and operational burdens on data broker companies, domestically, of course, in order to shift the burden of assuring privacy from uninformed consumers drowning in contractual legalese to the cunning and capable data handler. So why am I talking about domestic U.S. studies of data brokerage? Because no statistics or scholarship on international data brokering exists. Over 1,000 companies were buying, analyzing, and selling data to willing advertising, making billions of dollars in 2014. Surely tens of thousands of companies are doing the same worldwide today in 2019. Our data is being bought, analyzed, and sold without our knowledge, without our consent, and without any paper trail of accountability. So what are my solutions? An inherent goal of trade is democracy and community. Member states of all sizes and all compositions can create goods and other states buy those goods. As people are exposed to new goods and services whose trade is facilitated by the internet, people will become more informed and more resolved to live free of oppression in the exchange of ideas as well. In trading with each other at that table, in that moment of encounter, commercial enterprises and government leaders can brainstorm about how to supply people's demands and how to effectively make the world a better place. Data is a byproduct of the trade in goods and services. Since data is a commodity arising from the exchange of goods and services, it should be regulated by the international trade regime. Therefore, we need policies that shed light on the dark underworld of international data brokerage. We need policies to deter data brokers from unethical activities, violating consumers' reasonable expectations of privacy. We need policies that deter dystopic, anti-democratic government regimes and illegal and evil non-state actors from exploiting goods for evil. People have a reasonable expectation of privacy in their personally identifiable information, no matter what country they're from. Legal name, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, places of employment, political affiliation, marital status, health status, sexual activity information, financial information, Private media and correspondence like photos, videos, voice notes, and typed messages all belong to the people who sent them. Behind me are some means that the international trade system can achieve these lofty goals, establishing legal liability for illegal or undisclosed acquisition and misuse of data, especially if there's a provable harm. The system could tax data brokering or impose a reporting penalty for failing to disclose the acquisition or sale of data. The WTO could establish a data reporting body where member countries report data brokering transactions, domestic legislation, data breaches, data theft, and cybercrimes. There should be some darknet monitoring. Even if there is no enforcement, the documentation could be powerful. Those transparency requirements, impose them on brokering agreements, perhaps adding data to trading schedules under services, or perhaps data is a new good. The point is that people need to know where their data is going to assure it is not being used to subvert peace and stability. States may want to do this themselves in their own free trade agreements. However, I feel like this is a Band-Aid on a broken bone. Earlier, I mentioned balkanization. Let me clarify. My views align with that of the U.S. trade disposition for the last 70 years. I privilege free trade among all nations first and foremost. But just as the FTC turned a blind eye to the power of data in 2014, I don't want to turn a blind eye to the worst case scenario of data balkanization either. So can data balkanization be a promising option? It might. Data localization is related to a concept called data balkanization, or the splinter net. As the name and history suggest, balkanization is the strategic fracturing of the internet into localized sections. In one version of the balkanized internet, version light or the Great Firewall, the world may be interconnected via the internet, but states restrict the movement of their citizens' data from leaving the country. This would cause the collapse of gaps, since service sectors generally provide services limited in geography and time. International trade would rewind 30 years to the days before the internet, which would be comparatively grossly inefficient. And the change could cause global economic correction, aka collapse. In a more extreme version of a balkanized internet, or the version dark, there is no longer one internet for 7 billion people, but kind of like the Cambridge Analytica situation, there are 195 localized internets. People could not talk to each other freely anymore in an open internet. Rather, people would communicate through bridges, data highways built and maintained by governments that connect internets. Those data highways could be surveilled by governments and bad actors alike. It would be like playing whisper down the lane with your text messages. You wouldn't be able to assure that the person on the other side received the same text message you sent. How likely is data balkanization? 5 years ago, I would have told you it was impossible. Now in 2019, I say that it's unlikely, but possible, unless we take action. But what if we used balkanization to our advantage? I predict that over the next 20 years, nearly every global political sphere of influence will have its own data and privacy regime. Instead of every country coming up with its own laws, regions of countries with similar legal systems and similar cultural paradigms of privacy can create their own legal regimes. Remember, the only green tile on my slide about existing trade and data infrastructure was the tile for multilateral privacy agreements. I think that the positive view of balkanization of privacy regimes could look something like this map, a map of the World Bank's geopolitical regions. I'll stop here and open up the floor for questions and suggestions regarding my topic and proposals.
Take it away.
Prince, thanks a lot. That was a really good overview of all of the problems and issues. And, definitely feel more educated about it now. One of the issues that I was thinking about was I've seen documentaries on Cambridge Analytica before, and I think their counter argument is that it doesn't matter whether they do this sort of analysis at all, and the aggregate collection of information isn't undermining democracy, because at the end of the day, I still vote even if they gave me a bunch of bogus information to make that vote. So there's no prohibition on advertising, for example, and that doesn't necessarily impact the outcome of the election. So, and maybe you don't have to have an answer right now, but it might be interesting to hear the counter argument to that, which is that their position that the Cambridge Analytica model doesn't necessarily undermine democracy, they're just repackaging information for us.
My counter is that it does, of course. So there were instances in the US, for example, with disinformation campaigns, for example, like telling people you can vote by text message, or you vote on Wednesday, not Tuesday. All of our elections are on Tuesday, right? Who would not know that? But the advertising was used to disenfranchise certain sections of voting. So while they may say the collection of data itself may not prevent people from voting, some of the way that that data is used, its derivative use, is used to discourage people from voting. That's a domestic issue, it's not a national issue, but it's my counter to Cambridge Analytica.
I was just gonna bring up two things that are related to your use of data paper. One is huge in the news right now, is Google is under a ton of heat, getting a ton of heat for this new relationship they made with Ascension, which is like one of the largest healthcare. Yeah, so that plays into your whole theme about like you don't really know what businesses are giving what information to these data brokers or whatnot, but like healthcare data, something that we think is like super personal. I mean, that was just sold without me ever really consenting to that, having any. I don't even know if my data is included in that. So that's one thing I think you should definitely bring up. Cambridge Analytica is a great example also. But second, there might be some criticism that all of this use of privacy is making our lives better. I mean, like all this data, the more you give up, the better the AI gets. Spotify, Google teamed up and they gave out free Google Home Minis to anyone that wanted them if you have Spotify. And it's totally just to get my data, but it'll make all my services better. So if the majority of people don't seem to mind, that might be a counter. Overall though, amazing presentation.
Yeah, it was great. So I have a question about sort of something. Is there an impetus in the United States for legislative action around this? I'm constantly perplexed, given all the three big issues that you highlighted in the last 5-10 years that have happened. Americans don't necessarily still seem that compelled to legislate in this area, whereas there is the GDPR, and Europeans seem a little bit more seized with this. What is happening here? Is there more, how can we get people more interested in
So there's a bunch of bills on the Hill, but there's one in particular that is supposed to be like the bill to solve all bills in the Senate right now. Complete deadlock. It is resting with the Democratic leaders of the Commerce Committee, Senator Commerce, Transportation. And one of the issues is states are really taking this in their own right? This is domestic conversation. So California has its own, Illinois, I think Texas, Arizona. Some states are just like, I'm not gonna wait for the US to do it. I'm just gonna do it right now and protect my citizens right now. And so one of the issues with the federal legislation is preemption, right? And I think some states like Illinois, they create a private right of action. Well, Dems in DC and on the Hill don't want a private right of action. They don't want people finding out Google took my health information, notified me that they were giving it to Ascension, and now I can sue and I can get money for what would be worth or the harms I would incur, right? And it's really those minute issues that are just in political gridlock. But meanwhile, the Cambridge Analytica can happen again. I mean, more voter suppression has happened in the 3 elections since 2016 with no sign of end in sight.
and another election coming?
And the census.
So my inclination on sort of the international issues of your paper are that it might be better to look at it from the GATS point of view rather than the WTO point of view. I think it's going to be hard to argue that it's a good in the traditional sense. I think it's an easier argument to target the services. I'm not certain on that. But like given, I just kind of, that's my inclination generally. You might want to look into that a little bit more, but that's how I feel it would go.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I had a question on the international front from a developing country perspective. A lot of developing countries, and that includes South Asia, Africa, where the privacy framework is not that developed and nor is it privileged. So when it comes to security and privacy, people will always, give up a lot of civil liberties to be safe, which was the same thing in the US right after 9/11, right? People gave up a lot of civil liberties. Now it's been 20 years, so people have kind of forgotten the reason that was done. But in Africa and India, people really will not. I mean, it's not even a concern to that extent, other than your financial and health information. But there's so much information. There's a question of data ownership too, in the sense of who really owns the data. I mean, we as individuals give away so much of data, with consent on a constant basis. And each of these little bits of information by themselves have no value that we can see, and there's no imminent harm. The harm is going to be in the future. So we don't really think about it. But the fact is that it's in the aggregate, it becomes valuable. And then you have data analysis, as you said, it's run. And then you have these data sets, and who owns those data sets? Right, so there are all these other questions at the granularity, which I think, are difficult issues.
I think sometimes from a kind of international level, these sort of regional perspectives may be a little bit interesting to. So just as an example, in Canada, we got very concerned about your Patriot Act. After 9/11, we thought, oh my God, these Americans, And so there was blanket legislation that said personal information, particularly health information, could not be stored outside Canada. And we live in a world where you've got healthcare information, you've got MRIs, you've got that. The world goes according to time zones. Your call center is in the US in the morning, and London in the afternoon, and Singapore in the evening, because nobody sleeps. And I remember having to authorize very significant stuff to be able to be passed on to a call center individual that we needed to get support for, to get an MRI machine working in the middle of the night, who happened to be in Singapore, and those kinds of things. So this idea of being able to hold it within a particular region becomes very difficult when the world is so interconnected, and we found ourselves constantly dealing with issues such as this. Our staff going across the border, what the heck do you do with a cell phone? Do you make sure you don't have any personal information? It was crazy. So you might want to think about, from a practical point of view, everything is stored in the cloud. How the heck do I know where exactly it is? And those kinds of things. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it is a factor to keep in mind.
So you don't get a chance to answer that.
Okay.
And I get the last word. So I think what's fun about your paper is the way it makes you think about regulation. You think, you brilliant problem presentation, and then regulation is the answer. But I think you need to penetrate more deeply. What do you mean by regulation? Are you regulating the data itself? Are you regulating behavior? Are you regulating the market, the brokerage markets? Are you regulating what governments can do by way of intervention? So I think it's fun to kind of flesh out what is your theory of regulation, and can you give that theory of regulation a name? That you're a, I don't know, privacyist, or you're a whatever. Anyway, that's the last word.
What's the closest example that you can give to illustrate that? And so going back to Alex's question, trade is mostly about barriers, goods, but you're talking about failure to do something, which is a different challenge for regulation. I think you ought to address that.
And that's it. Next. Thank you very much.